What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today we have got our week 2 fantasy wide receiver starts and sits for every single matchup. So make sure to tune in. If you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. Also check us out online at All Day Pigskin for some exclusive content. Become a fantasy VIP and get personalized fantasy advice throughout the entire season from yours truly. Also check us out online on Twitter at All Day Pigskin. Give us a follow so you can continue interacting with us throughout the week and we can answer your specific questions. But for now, let's get right into it. Before getting into it, a quick word from our sponsor at Overlay Fantasy Sports, who take DFS to a whole nother level. And if you guys are sick and tired of betting on the same old Team A versus Team B money line and spread picks, well, have no fear. Overlay Fantasy is here to help you out, especially with their new matchup shop function, which allows you to select between individual player matchups from a numerous amount of games every single week. Not only NFL, but Before getting into it, a quick word from our sponsor at Overlay Fantasy Sports, who take DFS to a whole nother level. And if you guys are sick and tired of betting on the same old Team A versus Team B money line and spread picks, well, Overlay Fantasy is here to help you out with their matchup shop function, which allows you to pick between individual player matchups every single week for whichever game you want. All you have to do is find the matchup that you like, put a couple dollars on it, and potentially win big. So do yourself a favor. Don't only do all of that player matchup homework just to benefit your fantasy team, but also do it so it can benefit your wallet. And Overlay Fantasy Sports does a great job of giving you that opportunity. As you can see, there's a bunch of bets here that you can take a chance on, not only quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, whatever the case might be. And the NFL isn't the only option here. So if you're someone that's all about golf or MLB or NBA, well, Overlay Fantasy Sports has that for you. So make sure to go ahead and check them out. For our first matchup of the week on Thursday night, we've got the Bengals at the Browns. And here, obviously, you pretty much see every single starting wide receiver listed as a fire-up option. But let's break it down a little bit further. So for the Browns, you've got Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry, the two big names. And Landry was honestly listed as someone that potentially might be questionable for us leading up to this contest, but reports are, even though he was nicked up, that he will be suiting up. Now, obviously, this is a situation to monitor, but as things stand right now, he would be someone that we start. We like him more so in PPR formats, and he's probably the safer of the two options compared to Odell Beckham. But speaking of Odell Beckham, another disappointing game in week 1. Yes, the targets were there, which is really nice to see, but how many of those targets were actually catchable? And that more so goes back to Baker Mayfield, and why, honestly, we don't see either one of these guys for the Browns as wide receiver 1 options this week, probably in the wide receiver 2 category for the time being, until we see something from Baker Mayfield that gives us confidence. The one positive here is they'll be going up versus the Bengals defense, which is a positive matchup. Then for the Bengals, you've got Tyler Boyd, you've got AJ Green. I see them both as high-end wide receiver 2s. AJ Green, while he's healthy, he's probably got the higher upside, but Tyler Boyd may be a little bit safer. Next, we go to the Giants at the Bears, and here I'm going to start Allen Robinson. And I've said this before, even though someone like an Anthony Miller for the Bears is a hot name, this Bears offense with Mitchell Trubisky under center does not have the ability to sustain 2 fantasy-relevant wide receivers. Unless Anthony Miller gets a touchdown, he won't be fantasy relevant, whereas Allen Robinson will get all the targets. That's why we like him as a start pretty much regardless, specifically in PPR formats even more so. Then for the Giants, this is where it gets a little bit tough because this is a similar matchup to what we saw last week versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Great Bears defense. Unless you have to, I really wouldn't want to play one of these giant wide receivers, but if we're forced to choose, A pair, we're looking at Shepard and we're looking at Darius Slayton again. Slayton had the big game versus the Steelers. I do believe he has that higher ceiling, higher touchdown upside, whereas Sterling Shepard will probably get some more targets and maybe a little bit of a better option in PPR formats. But either way, both these guys are wide receiver twos at best. And on the sit side, we've got Anthony Miller. Like we said, if he doesn't get a touchdown, Anthony Miller is very limited. And game plan here for the Bears, unless they are down in the fourth quarter again like they were versus the Lions, is going to be run the ball and be a game manager for Mitch Trubisky. You also see Golden Tate here on the sit list. He obviously didn't play in week 1. There's a chance he suits up for week 2, probably will, but coming off of an injury, we'd probably go ahead and wait until week 3 to assuredly fire him up as a weekly start. Then Rams at Eagles. Here, we're firing up both the Rams wide receivers, Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods. Woods was excellent in week 1, got a bunch of targets, a lot of receptions, and don't worry, for all you Cooper Kupp truthers, that will also follow for Kupp. We really like both these guys as low-end wide receiver ones in PPR scoring. But then for the sits, we're sitting Josh Reynolds. That next third wide receiver just doesn't have as much value for the Rams after the departure of Brendan Cooks, at least from what we saw in week 1. And then for the Eagles, we honestly don't trust any of their wide receivers during this point in time. Jalen Reagor, Deshaun Jackson, probably the two biggest names. Alshon Jeffrey is the guy that most of us are waiting for him to return. He's going to be the most reliable guy, but for now, it's going to be the two tight ends in Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert like we saw last week. Then Falcons at the Cowboys. I love every single wide receiver option here. And the way you see things listed from Julio Jones all the way down to Russell Gage and Amari Cooper all the way down to CeeDee Lamb is my preferred start rankings for these guys. Now, Julio Jones, top 3, top 5 wide receiver, but Calvin Ridley not that far behind. I've told you guys pretty much since the start of the fantasy season and before that we love Calvin Ridley. He absolutely balled out last week. 2 touchdowns. He was sensational. Now, do make a note of that. Not every game will we see 54 pass attempts from Matt Ryan, but still, I love Calvin Ridley as a wide receiver 1. And then potentially Russell Gage. He's a guy that his arrow is pointing up. We saw him get a lot of opportunities versus Seattle in week 1. And he's someone that I would take a flyer on in flex situations in PPR formats because I do think this could be a very high-scoring game again. And then for the Cowboys, again, Amari Cooper is my top-ranked option. You kind of saw it in week 1. He got the most amount of targets, then Michael Gallup, then CeeDee Lamb. I think those two guys are going to be much closer in terms of rankings for the rest of the season than many of us anticipate, with Amari Cooper being the number 1 choice. We've got the Panthers at the Buccaneers next, and for the starts, we're starting DJ Moore and we're starting Robbie Anderson. DJ Moore is the much preferred option. Yes, he was slightly disappointing in week 1, but he is going to get more targets, more volume, and especially with someone like Teddy Bridgewater, who throws the ball quickly, DJ Moore will benefit from that. Robbie Anderson did have a very nice stat line, but if you take away that 75-yard touchdown, it was pretty pedestrian. But in a game versus the Bucs where we anticipate Bridgewater will have to air it out a bunch, Robbie Anderson, not a bad play, but more so a low-end wide receiver 2 option. Then for the Bucs, right now, you see Chris Godwin here listed as a start, but the way things are trending, he could very well miss this contest due to a concussion. So for that reason, obviously, you could move him in the sit category. Mike Evans and then Scotty Miller get a huge boost. And Scotty Miller, especially in PPR formats, could be a decent wide receiver 2 option. Then for the sits, we're sitting Curtis Samuel. He's the next guy you left out of these Carolina wide receivers. We just don't think he will get enough volume in this offense. Moving on to the 49ers at the Jets. Honestly, for the 49ers, if you're searching for a wide receiver option, we think Kendrick Bourne is the best one that you have at this point in time, but really nobody to get overly excited about. Yes, the 49ers just signed Mohamed Sanu, but him being with the team for less than a week, we don't have all that many expectations from him. That's why he is currently on our sit list. Then for the Jets, Jamison Crowder currently nicked up, so if he doesn't suit up, then it's going to be the Brashad Perriman show. If he does play, then we'll still go and start him because he should get a lot of volume. But right now, he's probably trending closer to a sit than a start. Following this, we've got the Broncos at the Steelers. We're starting Juju Smith-Schuster. We're starting Deontay Johnson. We saw it last week from both of these guys. Juju Smith, a low-end wide receiver one. Nice to see him get in the end zone. And then for Deontay Johnson, he got a good amount of targets, a mid-level wide receiver two. Then for the Broncos, Courtland Sutton. Look, if he's available, you have to start him. He's the most reliable wide receiver on this Broncos offense. But right now, again, it doesn't look like he will be suiting up. If he does, you start him. If you don't, you put him in that sit category. But for what it's worth, even if he does sit, we're also sitting his teammate Jerry Jeudy because we just don't quite believe in Drew Lock. And this is a very tough situation defensively versus the Steelers. We saw what the Steelers did versus Daniel Jones in week one. We think it'll probably be even better versus Drew Lock, so we're sitting Jerry Jeudy. Then we've got the Jaguars at the Titans. As far as starts for the Jaguars, DJ Chark is our preferred option, but Laviska Shenault could get some opportunities like we saw in week one. Chark is probably a high-end wide receiver 2, whereas Shenault is a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 type of option. Then for the Titans, A.J. Brown. This Jaguars defense doesn't scare me. Yes, Brown didn't have that great of a start to the season in week one, but we still believe he is the wide receiver to own for the Titans. And with that being said, looking at our sits, we are sitting Corey Davis. Yes, he kind of had a reemergence in week one, but again, we don't believe that this will continue, and we were probably going to see that A.J. Brown shift sooner rather than later for the Titans offensively. Then Lions, Packers, you're obviously sitting Davante Adams. You saw what he did in week one, the top fantasy wide receiver. He could very well do it again in week two. For the Lions, assuming Kenny Golladay does not play, which maybe is the case right now as things stand. Obviously, if he plays, you put him in the start column. But otherwise, Marvin Jones and Danny Amendola. Marvin Jones is then the next best wide receiver available, and Danny Amendola in PPR options could get a good amount of targets versus a game against the Packers that should be pretty high scoring. Then in the sits, we're sitting both MVS and Allen Lazard. Yes, they had some nice moments in week one, but it's so hard to differentiate between these two guys. Who's actually the wide receiver 2 behind Davante Adams? And unless one of these guys gets a touchdown, you're probably looking at a stat line of right around 5 receptions for 50 yards, and we just don't feel all that comfortable in that. Moving on, we've got the Bills at the Dolphins. We love the Bills wide receivers here, Stephon Diggs and John Brown. The Dolphins defense does not scare us. We probably think Diggs and Brown have pretty similar stat lines. You saw it in week one, pretty similar outings, and whoever gets the touchdown, that will be the point of separation. Then for the Dolphins, you're starting Preston Williams. He's probably a mid-level to low-end wide receiver 2. But versus this Bills defense, probably closer to a low-end wide receiver 2. You see Devontae Parker, the big-name wide receiver for the Dolphins, listed as a sit. He didn't play he didn't play the full game in week one as he got nicked up. Now his status may be a little bit up in the air. And if he's not 100%, this is a tough matchup versus a good Bills defense. Moving on, we've got the Vikings at the Colts. You're starting Adam Thielen every single week. He is the top option for Kirk Cousins and this Vikings offense. He will get all the targets. He's the favorite to get the touchdown. We love Adam Thielen as a top 10 wide receiver for the rest of the season. Then for the Colts, T.Y. Hilton was disappointing in week one. Several dropped opportunities, but guess what? This is a perfect bounce back game. Phillip Rivers airs out the football like we saw in week one. And this is a secondary in the Vikings that is going to be one of the worst in the league. I expect T.Y. Hilton to have a big bounce-back game, and I see him as a low-end wide receiver 1. Then Paris Campbell, the kind of surprising wide receiver to come out of Indianapolis in week 1. He saw a lot of targets, and again, similar to T.Y. Hilton, I don't think he has as high of a ceiling as Hilton, but he could be a decent mid to low-end wide receiver 2 versus this Vikings secondary. Moving on, we've got the Washington football team at the Arizona Cardinals. You're starting DeAndre Hopkins. I see this as a situation similar to what the Packers have in Devontae Adams. Hopkins will get all those targets. He is the clear-cut #1 wide receiver. You saw it in week 1. Then for Washington, Terry McLaurin, but he isn't nearly as high on our rankings maybe as you would think. We see him as a low-end wide receiver 2, and that's mostly because of the volume. And this again comes back down to Dwayne Haskins, because even though he got the win as a game manager in week 1, that won't cut it for the rest of the season, and especially in fantasy football. Being a game manager does not help your wide receivers, which is the situation Terry McLaurin is in right now. Then for the sits, we're sitting Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald. Like I said before about Allen Lazard and MVS, this is a situation that I see similarly with Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald. You don't really know who the next best wide receiver option will be on a week-to-week basis after DeAndre Hopkins, and this is a good Washington defense, so we are fading both of these guys. Moving on, we've got the Ravens at the Texans. For the Ravens, pretty much the only wide receiver on a week-to-week basis that I'm going to start is Marquise Brown, and know that it's going to be a boom or bust type of situation. And what we mean by that, it's going to be big play dependent, 4 receptions for 100 yards, something like that. Then for the Texans, Will Fuller, Brendan Cooks. We've currently got Will Fuller higher on our rankings as a high-end wide receiver 2 here. The matchup isn't the best versus this Ravens defense. We've got him higher than Brendan Cooks because Cooks was limited, going into week 1. Now, is he still 100% TBD? So we've got him ranked a little bit lower than Will Fuller as potentially a mid-level to low-end wide receiver 2. Then we're sitting Kenny Stills, we're sitting Randall Cobb. They're well-known wide receivers for the Texans, but we just don't think they will get enough targets here. Moving on, we've got the Chiefs at the Chargers. You're starting Tyreek Hill, top 10 option, preferred option in standard formats. And here it's a tough matchup, but he's still the wide receiver that we trust most with Patrick Mahomes. And then for the Chargers, you're starting Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, but you're going to have to adjust your rankings for both of these guys for the rest of the season, because with Tyrod Taylor, neither one of these guys are even low-end wide receiver 1s. Keenan Allen, I think he's a mid-level wide receiver 2, and that's in PPR scoring, just because Tyrod Taylor does not air out the football enough, doesn't provide enough targets like a Phillip Rivers would. Then Mike Williams, a preferred option in standard scoring. Then I'm going to sit Sammy Watkins and Mecole Hardman, pretty much the rest of the Kansas City receiving core. Sammy Watkins was great in week 1, even outscored Tyreek Hill, but let's not freak out about this. Let's look back at what Sammy Watkins did in week 1 in 2019, and then remember that for the rest of the season moving forward, he never had over 100 yards receiving and didn't get in the end zone afterwards. So again, temper your expectations there. Next, we've got the Patriots at the Seahawks. I'm starting Julian Edelman. And yes, the ceiling for Edelman in PPR scoring isn't going to be as high as we would have hoped for now with Cam Newton in town, because there's going to be a bigger priority on rushing the football. But still, out of all those wide receivers in New England, I prefer Julian Edelman. And this week in a matchup versus the Seattle Seahawks, where the Patriots will have to air it out, I think Julian Edelman is a solid mid-level wide receiver 2. Then for Seattle, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, the #1 and #2 options respectively in the passing attack. We saw Russell Wilson do a great job versus the Falcons in airing it out. I think Lockett and Metcalf, you could argue, are both good low-end wide receiver 1 options. And then for the sits, I'm sitting N'Keal Harry. I honestly just don't trust anyone outside of Julian Edelman in this receiving core. And Cam Newton will probably continue to focus on rushing the football if week 1 was any indication. And finally, we've got the Saints at the Raiders. And here, obviously, the big news, Michael Thomas not on this list. And that's because with that high ankle sprain, he's going to be out for several weeks. So Emmanuel Sanders pretty much becomes a must start until then. I see him as a high-end wide receiver 2, maybe a bit of a higher ceiling in PPR scoring. Then for the Raiders, Henry Ruggs and Nelson Aguilar, low-end wide receiver 2s. If you're desperate, you could start them. Henry Ruggs, probably a boom or bust type of candidate. But I'm looking at the matchup here, and I think the Saints are going to put up a bunch of points versus the Raiders. That's why I'm okay starting Ruggs and Nelson Aguilar, because they're going to get a lot of opportunities, and pretty much volume being the main situation here. And then I'm going to sit Bryan Edwards. He got a little bit nicked up in week 1, and again, he's in that rookie status, so not all that comfortable. And the Saints defense, after all, is pretty tough. I don't think we're going to be able to rely on all of these Raiders wide receivers. So with that, we wrap up our week 2 fantasy wide receiver starts and sits. And as always, let us hear it in the comment section. Did you agree, disagree? And let us know your own start and sit questions for week 2. And in the meantime, if you guys enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Also, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us throughout the week. And potentially become a fantasy VIP on our website at alldaypigskin.com to get personalized fantasy advice from yours truly throughout the season. In the meantime, we'll see you guys in future videos.